himself a modern home. Will he be allowed to keep it?
The new post-World War II order, led by the West, moved to create the State of Israel, and in 1948 voted to partition Palestine at the UN. Palestinians opposed partition and voted no, but as history has shown us time and time again, Palestinians were of no consequence to these great powers, and 52 years later, Herzl's dream of colonizing Palestine came true. As the British Empire was decomposing, a new liberal world order was taking shape, and Zionists recognized the need for a new imperialist patron.
We set up the Israeli government in Palestine, moved some of the Arabs out.
As a settler colony, Israel needed a metropole, and unlike other settler colonies, for Israel it wasn't one country, but the entirety of the West led by the United States. The same way the Zionist movement was an extension of British imperialism in Palestine, Israel now served at the forefront of Western imperialism in the Middle East. It was part and parcel of the establishment and the New World Order, U.S. unipolarity and Western hegemony.
5,000 times in my career, the Ironclad Committee of the United States has to Israel, based on our principles, our ideas, our values. They're the same values.
Against the backdrop of the Cold War, oil extraction, and financial interests in the region, Israel served as an outpost of the US and the West to safeguard these interests. That is why Biden said this:
the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region.
Israel is vital to their interests. At the same time, Israel and Jewish American communities built powerful lobbying, financial, and organizational power in the US that impacted and influenced US politics and foreign policy for decades. This special relationship has led to unconditional support from the US and the West, regardless of which party is in power. Israel has been the largest cumulative recipient of US foreign aid. Despite projections of power, Israel wouldn't survive without the US.
Tonight, the US military is now rushing military supplies and air defenses to Israel.
And it couldn't have carried out its genocide in Gaza without their support. When you analyze why Israel exists from the lens of colonization, imperial power, and Western hegemony, you fully understand why there's no accountability.
Deciding the fates of the children from families from the Middle East, from North Africa, and from the Balkans. There is an unquestionable racial component to the judgments they're making. Every time they're deciding whether or not it's better for them to go back to their families or on to somewhere else.
To shed light on what James Eastwood calls the racial component, Gamal al-Maliki met an anthropology professor in California who specializes in Mizrahi studies. The Mizrahim were Jews who lived mainly in the Arab world. Mizrahi means Easterner in Hebrew.
And this is my granny about 40 years ago in the Passover ceremony in the Knesset, in International Women's.
Maybe I should start with the framework for the issue. And the framework starts with the fact that Zionism gave Jews a homeland in Palestine. It was European Jews who had an idea of having a state which is Jewish and democratic. And it is contradictory to have a Jewish democracy because it assumes Jewish supremacy. And within Jewish supremacy, you have a race relation between Jews from Yiddish-speaking countries, or the Ashkenazim, and Jews who came mainly from the Muslim and Arab world. So in order to be a citizen in Israel, the citizenship is based on biologism and religion. In that sense, if you're a childless Ashkenazi, you'd better adopt a Jew baby that his Judaism has no doubt, or as the Hebrew saying goes, Yahaduto lo mutelet besafek. There is doubtless Judaism. Mizrahi Jews, particularly Yemeni Jews, didn't intermarry. So one is very sure that their babies are pure Jews, so they can fit into the citizenship model of Israel.
Shoshana Madmani Gerber is of Yemenite descent and echoes this view of a class hierarchy within Israeli society.
just mostly people, European people, that were arriving and were instating these policies, and they were looking down at all the people that came to Israel from the Arab world. I asked one of the nurses, I said, how could you sleep at night? And she said to me, maybe we did them a favor. We did this because there's families without children that wanted children. And even another mother that we interviewed, she said, oh, the doctor told us these are nice children, but the families can't help them, can't take care of them. They don't have enough money to take care of them. So they were thinking, you know, again, this is a very Orientalist way of thinking, a very racist way of thinking about who can be a parent and who cannot be a parent.
So actually, to have Jewish babies who are Mizrahi being trafficked or sold is a good business. Because if you're an Ashkenazi childless Jewish family and you do not want to have problems of citizenship, you'd rather get a Jewish baby. And the other ideology is that Arabs or Muslims are primitive. They don't use contraceptives. They have large families. So they can do away with like 1, 2, 3 children as long as their skin color is light. So this was a logic of having pure Jews, Jewish babies, being traded or sold as pure citizens of the state.
יש ילד שידוע לנו שנגיד יגאל אלון, הביא במתנה, הלך כמו שהולכים לאמץ כלב, הוא הלך למעון כזה עם ילדים, והעביר ילד למשפחה שהוא רצה לעזור לה.
If the scope of intra-Jewish racism is known to the world, Israel is not going to have so much sympathy, particularly not from the Western Jewish community. So the acts of kidnapping babies and selling them for adoption, in a sense, if the scope of all of this is known to the Mizrahi publics, they are going to doubt the righteousness of Israel.
Even the students, most students have heard about Tay-Sachs, but short of Tay-Sachs and maybe 1 or 2 other disorders, they rarely, if ever, have heard about Gaucher or any of the other Ashkenazi Jewish diseases. Ashkenazi Jews, which represent about 75% of American Jewry, we married our first cousins for approximately 200 generations. We have a greater burden of genetic disease because, in fact, many of us are related. We're cousins. We may be distant cousins, but in fact, the literature indicates that approximately 42% of us are related to 1 of 4 women that live between the 12th and 13th century. When you think about that, and the list of genetic disorders that appear to be more prevalent in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, you're actually looking at a likelihood that 1 out of 4 persons of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry will be a carrier for at least one of the top 16 to 17 disorders.
Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. I think I got the answer to a big, big issue. Where did they get all of those Jews from to populate Israel? Boy, what a wild turn this is taking. Have you ever heard of the term ringworm? You know, kids used to get ringworm. Yeah. They came up with a plan to get rid of ringworm. Well, gee. Seems like it was more to get rid of Jewish kids, if you ask me. But before I get started, I didn't mention in the last show, you might also look on eBay. Look for walkie-talkies and emergency radios on eBay. What you want to do, if you have time, is look for eBay sellers that are selling out of China. You'll save about 30-40%. So yeah, don't just go to Amazon, look at eBay. Okay, so I have been working on this mining deal for Rwanda. Last I left off with Rwanda, 100% it was started by the United States. Well, then, interestingly enough, after I left the Rwanda show, I did not talk during that show about what's going on now. Like, they've declared war in that area so that they could basically rob the Congo, is the bottom line here. But who is robbing the Congo? Well, interesting story. Looks like Israel and the United States. But before we go there, let's talk about how did they get these Jews into Israel? Lots of weird things going on. For example, there were a lot of Yemenite children airlifted into Israel on a program called Magic Carpet. I think the effort was to kill off the Jews who were not the Ashkenazi. So in other words, best way to take down your enemy is to figure out a way to kill off their children, right? And they imported all these children to Israel. Well, what were they doing? Well, supposedly they were eradicating ringworm. What they said was that ringworm was causing problems with children, so they set up x-ray machines. And it was also carried out among children in Yugoslavia. Over 90,000 children got hit there. In Portugal, 30,000 children. Syria, 7,000 children. And 4,600 were eradicated just between the years 1992 and 1958 in just one hospital in London. Yeah, they said these kids have ringworm. We're going to fix it. Well, they only were interested in fixing the ringworm for a special group of kids. And I'll be getting more into that. Do you realize that when I covered the show about Weimar, the people that were doing all of these sex in the streets, the child pornography and all that, were the Jews. And I remember during that show, I was commenting and saying, gee, that's odd that the Jews completely control all of that filthy business going on, the prostitution, the child, and all that stuff, when there was such a small population of Jews in Weimar at that time. Well, it was these particular Jews, the Zionist Jews. Are you aware that the Jews are the ones who now own that filthy Pornhub? Yeah, a Jewish rabbi actually owns Pornhub. They just want to spread that filth all over the place. This is a hill that I'm going to die on, and I want you to listen to me very carefully. This is who I think these people are. And listen to this sentence. The former European gypsies that have converted to Jews have taken over the West. I'm going to die on this hill because that is who these people are. They are the gypsies. Remember, early on, the Ashkenazi could not have their own children, so they stole them. I've talked about this in the past, but now I'm going to go really deep into what exactly they stole. Because it was those DNA kits that led us on to the fact that the Ashkenazis come from a bottleneck. Bottleneck, that is a nice word for incest. So the 300 base of these people all got started with incest. So, because of the incest, their line now has all kinds of diseases to it. And then because of the incest, they needed to steal children to populate Israel. I believe right now, also 100%, they created Israel to mine the Middle East, to go in and control those mines. And they're already doing it now. I was just casually watching this Panama Papers documentary a couple days ago about a company named Glencore. Well, Glencore, they're in there robbing and raping the Congo. So what happened is that they're keeping the war going so that they can continue to exploit the Congo. And who is doing the exploiting? Well, none other than the U.S. and Israel. But I will have to get back to that later because today I just want to focus on how they shifted around that population in Israel. Because I was also looking into people from the Congo. I talked about people from the Congo left there for the UK and the US to run because of all the abuse going on. People in the Congo trying to tell the truth are being pushed out of the Congo. I think how it happened was this. In the 1666, we had that Zevi guy, Z-E-V-I, the guy who was over in Turkey. He was the one, and all of those Jews traveled over to get readings from this person. I believe he was the one that was taking notes of the list of the Jews. So when it came time for World War I and II, they knew exactly where to go to pick up the goods from the Jews they planned on destroying in the camps. Because this was about getting rid of certain Jews, so the Zionist Jews. And also, don't forget, right about that same era, David Sassoon left the Turkey area. He went to India. He set up those Zionism schools, and he also traveled to the UK. That is how the Zionism got started. So what I'm going to be doing first here, I'm going to be playing a couple of clips. The first one was why Israel was created. The next one is, why did over 2,000 Yemenite babies disappear in 1950s Israel? Another one, Ashkenazi Jews may be more susceptible to some genetic diseases. Then I'll have a couple more clips. I'm not sure where I'm going to play them. These first couple of clips, I may play those. You may have already heard those at the intro, because the other clips that I'll play, let's just figure I played those clips already. So now I will be playing these two clips. The first one is why Israel kidnaps children. The second clip will be Operation Magic Carpet, 1949, the ongoing rescue of the Jews of Yemen. Very, very, very important things to pay attention to for this discussion now. So I'm going to play those clips now, and then I will come back. Basically, the Ashkenazi set out to literally murder the other Jews. And they did that during World War II with the concentration camps and whatnot. And then they set up Israel, which encouraged really Jews from all over the world. Hey, we're going to make a place for all of you. Come on over here. Well, they only really wanted certain Jews to go to Israel. So they came up with this absolutely insane deal with these ringworms to go around and start zapping children with ionizing radiation. I kid you not. So first, let's play those two clips so we can unpack it this way.
You might have heard about children in Gaza going missing, kidnapped by Israeli soldiers. It's so evil, it sounds utterly absurd. But Israel's done this kind of thing before. I'm talking about a mass kidnapping that happened when Israel declared itself a state, when thousands of children disappeared and never returned. But they weren't Palestinian, they were Jewish.
It started as a rumor. Later on, it became a myth.
What is considered to be one of the largest cover-ups in the history of Israel.
This horrific crime and its cover-up tell us everything we need to know about Zionism and the core philosophy that's connected to every other colonial reality in the world. Let me explain.
Israel's independence.
It's 1948. Zionist militias have just razed hundreds of Palestinian villages, displaced 750,000 Palestinians, and declared Israel a state. At this stage, there are about 650,000 Jews living there. A minority were Palestinian Jews who'd been living there for ages, but the majority were recent settlers who'd moved to Palestine as part of the Zionist project. And most of these old-timers, as they'd come to be known, were Central or Eastern European, or what's called Ashkenazi Jews. They pioneered the Zionist movement, made up the militias that orchestrated the Nakba, and served in Israel's first political parties and government. Now that they had succeeded in establishing a Zionist state, they needed to start filling it with more settlers.
They came from the displaced persons camps in Europe.
But all these European Jews weren't enough to colonize and work all the land that they had taken. If Israel wanted to be a viable state, it would need more Jews. So the Zionist entity had to look to the Arab world. See, there had always been Arab Jews living in Yemen, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, as well as in non-Arab countries like Iran and Turkey. But these Jews, Mizrahi Jews as they'd come to be known, came from a very different context. Ashkenazi Jews had been facing anti-Semitism, pogroms, and persecution in Europe for centuries, which is the environment that gave birth to the colonial Zionist project, and the feeling that there needed to be a Jewish homeland for Jewish safety in the first place. Mizrahi Jews, on the other hand, had been coexisting with their neighbors for centuries and were part of society. But the colonial creation of Israel ruptured these centuries-old relations, leading to Israeli rescue missions that airlifted them into the colony. And the story behind the huge covered-up crime this video is about starts with one rescue in particular. Operation Magic Carpet. Yes, that is the actual name.
Here is a place where a miracle occurred. 5,000 Jews escaping terror and slavery in the backward Arab state of Yemen.
Yemeni Jews weren't slaves. They were just poor, like most non-Jewish Yemenis were. In fact, Yemeni Jews had been living there for centuries and had chosen to move to Israel because they wanted to flee poverty and had bought into the biblical narrative. Meanwhile, in Israel, these Yemeni Jews were seen as unclean, primitive, backwards, and a threat to the European civilized image that Israel was trying to build. Ben-Gurion, Israel's prime minister at the time, had described Mizrahi Jews as rabble and would later say, "We don't want Israelis to become Arabs. It is incumbent upon us to struggle against the spirit of the Levant, which corrupts individuals and societies." But the Yemenis were still brought in. Why? One Zionist leader said that while Ashkenazi Jews were better suited for city work, Yemeni Jews would do well with agriculture because they, quote, need very little. They'd been tested already, decades before. Yemeni Jews had been brought in by early Zionist settlers when they realized they couldn't work the land well, and they had glowing reviews. Hence, Operation Magic Carpet. Israel took what was essentially the mass import of cheap labor and spun it into an Orientalist white savior story of rescue and redemption.
And with each step you pass from the dark ages to the present century, from bondage to freedom.
This racist, supremacist attitude Ashkenazis had towards Mizrahi Jews sets the scene for what happens next. These are the absorption camps where almost 50,000 Yemeni Jews were sent once they arrived in Israel. Tent cities with awful sanitation, where their belongings were taken, they were secularized, and forced to adopt new Hebrew names, abandon their languages and their culture. Ben-Gurion said, "The aim of the government is to inculcate the Yemeni immigrant with Israeli values to the point where he forgets where he came from." So Yemeni Jews were seen as people who needed to be civilized into the Israeli way of being, but at the same time, as a people who would, quote, never fully achieve modernity. This turned them into infants in the eyes of the Ashkenazi absorbers, thus taking over every decision regarding Mizrahim, and their children seemed natural. That brings us to the kidnapping. Between 1948 and the early 1950s, thousands of babies disappeared. This happened to lots of non-European Jewish families, but the majority were Yemeni. It happened in several ways. When Yemeni Jews arrived at the absorption camps, their babies were taken from them forcefully to structures called baby houses, under the pretense that these places were in better condition than the unhygienic camps. And from these baby houses, many children disappeared. Or they disappeared from hospitals when taken there for routine treatment. There were also cases of Yemeni mothers giving birth, their child being taken away by a nurse, and then never seen again.
ילדתי ילד, ילדתי חתול, עכבר, מה ילדתי? תראו לי אותו. למה אתם לא מראים לי כלום? גברת זרקנו. במילים האלה, גברת זרקנו.
Across each scenario, the story was pretty much the same. parents were told their child had died, but were shown no body, no grave, and no death certificate. Many of these parents believed that their children had not died, but had been taken away from them, and put up for adoption or sold to childless Ashkenazi couples.
אמרתי לו, אוקיי, בסדר, מת, אז תני לי לראות אותו פעם אחת, וזהו. ללטף אותו, לעשות לו משהו. היא עושה לי לא.
For years, these families campaigned for the truth and for justice, but were met with claims of myth and conspiracy. Decades later, some people were able to reconnect with their missing children through DNA tests.
After years of research, he found his biological mother, who was told, he says, that he had died during birth. He never told his adoptive parents he knew. They were Holocaust survivors.
Eventually, testimonies from those involved surfaced. One former senior nurse testified that Yemeni parents were not interested in their children, and that they should have been happy that their child got a good education. Another nurse told a Yemeni woman, "You have lots of children. Why not let us take one of them?"
נלקחו שם ילדים לאימהות צעירות מאוד שבאו ללדת, פשוט נעלמו הילדים, הם הוזמנו.
There are plenty of damning testimonies gathered by an NGO called Amram that suggest that this was systematic and widespread. And yet, 3 different government commissions over the course of decades claimed that most children had died, and that there was no evidence the state was involved. During one of these investigations, requests for birth and burial records disappeared, reported to have been destroyed by fires or floods. That coincidence was not investigated, and hundreds of thousands of documents from that inquiry were then classified. Only in 2016 was this issue finally acknowledged at the state level.
White people met here colored people and were supposed to be the same nation. They saw them as a problem that needs to be solved, and part of the solution was to take the children out. They will have a better life. Their identity will not be Middle Eastern. They will be sort of Europeans with dark skin.
It's a horrifying story, but it's not unique. Colonizers across the world have done this. From Australia to Canada to Belgium to France, the forcible removal of children and their re-education is standard practice for colonizers. And it's because despite their distance and space from one another, all these places share one core philosophy: white supremacy. It doesn't matter that the Mizrahi Jews were also settlers there to colonize the indigenous Palestinian population. They weren't white, and that made them vulnerable to their own cultural genocide. The story of the Yemeni children speaks to the only core principle of Zionism that matters, that it is inherently racist and violent against Palestinians and Jews alike. Zionism was invented by victims of white supremacy as their own version of white supremacy, where they could hold top rank. This story is just one of many that shatter the myth of Israel as a utopia and safe haven for Jews. Mizrahi Jews were safe before, and endangered upon their arrival to the white supremacist colony that saw them as nothing more than a primitive labor force. And that's the other thing that needs to be mourned in this story, the identity of the Arab Jew. That's at the core of why they were looked down upon by European settlers, because before being Jews, they were Arabs. The word Mizrahi, meaning Eastern, only serves to cover up this reality, that these were Arab Jews who culturally, linguistically, historically, had more in common with the Palestinians they were colonizing than the white settlers they were doing it alongside, or under. And so a system was born to keep them subjugated and dilute them of their culture, so they'd be far removed enough to see Palestinians as more of the other than the European settler who had always seen them as inferior. And so when we hear stories about Palestinian children being kidnapped in Gaza, this is not surprising. This is the extension and continuation of a long-held policy that the Zionist entity was built on. There's more details to this story that I didn't get to. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out our Patreon for more information.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו
In August 1992, the Jews of Yemen began arriving in Israel. The operation was kept a closely guarded secret. It was the result of 10 years of tireless effort on the part of the government of Israel and the Jewish Agency. They went through the absorption procedures like all other olim, except in their case, because of the special circumstances of this aliyah, total secrecy was preserved until the story broke in the media. These olim are among the remnants of the Jewish community of Yemen that at its height numbered about 50,000 Jews. Most of them came to Israel in 1949. This was the first mass aliyah to arrive in the newly established State of Israel. Taking their precious Torah scrolls with them, the Jews of Yemen boarded the unfamiliar flying machines in what became known as Operation Magic Carpet. The airplanes would span distance and time, taking them in a few short hours to a new world. Arriving, they kissed the earth that they had known only in dreams and in prayers. Once in Israel, they never forgot the families that stayed behind. Now, some of them are reunited with relatives they have not seen for 45 years. Cries of joy for a dream come true, but also deep emotion that spills over into tears as families come together after years of separation. The newly arrived olim take their first steps in Israel with the aid and encouragement of their families, who are by now an integral part of Israeli society. Their first glimpse of an Israeli apartment block, so different from the villages they have left behind. In the villages of Yemen, the women receive no formal instruction. Now, in an Israeli ulpan, they begin adjusting to a new culture, a new old language, a different sense of time. The children adjust more quickly because of their mastery of biblical Hebrew. Using the telephone is part of the process of beginning to feel at home in the unfamiliar new surroundings of the Jewish Agency Absorption Center in Rehovot, their first home in Israel. The kitchen is modern, but time-honored methods are not easily relinquished. From early in the morning, the Jamil family, who have been living at the absorption center since they arrived in Israel 6 months ago, have been hard at work, cooking for Shabbat. This afternoon, their 2 sons, who arrived in Israel just yesterday, will be here. Ra'ina spares no effort and prepares their favorite delicacies. At last, the moment they've been waiting for, the Jamil sons, Yichya and Yosef, with their wives and children, come to spend their first Shabbat in the Holy Land with their parents. Together with the joy, there are tears for close relatives left behind. The joyful reunion of the families began one day earlier at the Jewish Agency Absorption Center in Ashkelon. Veteran olim come looking for long-lost relatives. The air is electric, But behind the excitement, there is also bewilderment, even shock. Once here, the Olim take their first tentative steps in adjusting to a new culture. They still wear their traditional dress. Perhaps it's only a matter of time before we see some of them in jeans and t-shirts. For now, in the courtyard of the absorption center, the new Olim meet with the veteran immigrants, and they speak of that other country, Yemen.
حالي هن ما الشيء هنا أحسن من هناك هناك ضمياء وهنا ظهيرة.
Back at the home of the Jamils, the 17 members of this one family are preparing to spend Shabbat together. Despite the excitement of seeing the grandchildren and the anticipation of this, their first Shabbat together in Israel, the joy is not complete.
سمحت في قلبي وقفاني بناتي عادم بالتهمة أسمع على جهالي الله ينصرهم وينصر من طلعهم الله يكون مع المنفولة
אבל היא צריכה להיות שמחה שהבנות בואו.
على البنات كان بناتي وأخواتي هناك 3 خواتي.
How many Jews still remain in Yemen? Probably less than 1,000, most of them in villages in northern Sana'a and in Saada. Until the time for Aliyah comes, Kol Yisrael broadcasts from Jerusalem keep them in touch with Israel. The only contact with relatives in Israel, parents, brothers and sisters, children, comes through letters brought by goodwill messengers from the United States and from Europe. For centuries, these communities have cherished their tradition and their faith as lovingly as they have preserved the Torah scrolls in their village synagogues. Ceremonies like this Havdalah service to mark the departure of Shabbat are observed together, strengthening the close bond between the Jewish families. This Jewish cemetery bears no conventional markings, but despite this, every Jew is able to identify the graves of his loved ones. The children are taught biblical Hebrew from an early age. Their teacher uses the age-old method of the stick to keep his students attentive. Thanks to Operation Magic Carpet 1993, many of these Yemenite Jews have now come home to Israel. With the assistance of Jewish communities across the world, through Keren Hayesod United Israel Appeal, the Jewish Agency is funding this rescue effort as it continues to fund other rescue operations throughout the world. The Jews who have remained behind in Yemen have only one wish. What do we ask of you? Do not forget us.
Okay, so what I'm going to be doing now is talking to you about the difference. We have the Ashkenazi, which also, keep in mind, Nazi is part of their name, and the Sephardic are proper words to describe different groups of Jewish people. Ashkenazi Jews are those who originated from Central and Eastern Europe, while Sephardic Jews are those who originated from the Iberian Peninsula, meaning Spain and Portugal, and the Middle East. I have done several shows about tracing them through the whole area if you're interested in taking a look. The term Ashkenazi comes from the Hebrew word for Germany, where many of these Jews originally lived. Over time, the term has come to refer to Jews who lived in other parts of Europe as well, including Poland, Russia, and other Eastern countries. Ashkenazi Jews have a distinct cultural identity that is characterized by Yiddish language, traditional foods like Yemenite fish and matzo ball soup, and a strong emphasis on education and scholarship. On the other hand, the term Sephardic comes from the Hebrew word for Spain, where many of these Jews originally lived before being expelled during the Spanish Inquisition. Sephardic Jews have a distinct cultural identity that is characterized by the Ladino, Ladino language, which is a mix of Hebrew and Spanish. They eat traditional foods like paella and borracas and a strong emphasis on family and community. While both Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews share many similarities, they also have distinct differences in their cultural and historical backgrounds. Ashkenazi Jews are now the largest Jewish ethnic group in the world, with an estimated population of around 10 million. Sephardic refers to Jews of Spanish, Portuguese, or North African descent. The term Sephardic comes from the Hebrew word for Spain. Sephardic Jews have a unique history that has been shaped by their experiences in Spain and Portugal during the Middle Ages. They were expelled from these countries in the late 15th century, and many migrated to North Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of Europe. Today, now this is of a few years ago, there are an estimated 2 million Sephardic Jews in the world. Ashkenaz is a biblical term and a name of a grandson of Japhet, Japhet, the ancestor of the Romans. Perhaps because the area has been part of the Roman Empire, the region, its language, and its non-Jewish inhabitants were associated with that name. In time, the Jews living there became known as Ashkenazim as well. As Jews in Ashkenaz, they suffered successive waves of murderous crusades, Talmud burnings, massacres, and severe repression. They made their way to the more welcoming lands in the east. There, the Ashkenazi life flourished, and Yiddish, a Jewish concoction of German, Hebrew, Aramaic, and more, became the dominant language of the Jews of Eastern Europe until the double scourges of Nazism and communism conspired to kill millions of Jews and squelch the Jewish identity of billions of others. So, what did they do to do all this? Well, this is the part that just borderlines on so evil. They had this thing called the ringworm. Yes, ringworm affair refers to circumstances involving an alleged number of 20,000 to 200,000 Jews who were treated between 1948 and 1960 for what's called tinea capitis, or ringworm. They were treated with ionizing radiation to the head and neck area within Israel. The population suffering from the disease in Israel at the time was composed primarily of newly arrived immigrants and populations who were expected to immigrate mostly from North Africa, as well as some from the Middle East and elsewhere. But many Jewish children were irradiated in their home countries regardless of their intent to immigrate. So what they did was they went around the world and said, "Oh, you ever thinking about immigrating?" "Yeah, we're thinking about immigrating." "Okay, well, give us your kids. We're going to zap them." So yeah, they went around and they identified Jewish, obviously Sephardic kids, and said, "Well, we're going to go ahead and treat your kids over here too." The irradiation of Mizrahi children is viewed by activists in Israel as the most salient example of injustices encountered in the 1950s as a result of shortcomings of responsibility on the part of authorities in the absorption in Israeli society of new immigrants. There's a very interesting documentary that I have down below. I watched it. I was going to try to narrate it for you because it's only with subtitles, but that became too complicated for me to navigate today. So what I'm going to be doing is telling you what this show was all about, and then hopefully you will go and look for yourself. There was a documentary film titled The Ringworm Children. It was released in 2003. The film, which claims that 100,000 children received radiation doses thousands of times beyond what is safe. However, in 2018, the film's creator distanced himself from it, claiming it doesn't meet the scientific criteria. And they said that the number who suffered health complications as a result of the treatment is unclear. A study by the Israeli Minister of Health in coordination with UNICEF, who assisted in the purchase of X-rays for the project, estimated that 15,000 children were radiated during this period. They say as high as 200,000 children were irradiated using this old X-ray equipment. Ringworm in Israel and Jewish communities. The scalp and ringworm also, they used to treat it with like vinegar and something. I mean, ringworm is also what people talk about as athlete's foot. It's nothing like deadly or dangerous. Okay? The scalp ringworm, also known as Tinea capitis, was one of the most common fungal diseases in children in the Jewish communities in Israel and abroad since the 19th century. An X-ray treatment for ringworm has been used around the world as early as 1897. They started treating ringworm with X-ray equipment. And they keep coming back. They say, well, an estimated 200,000 children worldwide receive X-ray treatments for the ringworm in accordance with this procedure between 1910 and 1959. So they were clearly zapping children for a lot of years between 1910 and 1959. At the beginning of the 20th century, Hadassah Medical Center in Jerusalem treated ringworm disease among the religious Jewish community in Jerusalem using irradiation, and the disease almost disappeared. With mass immigration from Arab and Muslim countries in the 1940s and 1950s, many new cases of ringworm surfaced, primarily among immigrant children from Asia and North Africa, due to crowded living conditions with deficient hygiene facilities. At this time, ringworm was still treated with irradiation under the supervision of this medical center. The treatment regime increased the risk of cancerous and non-cancerous growths on the head and neck areas, years later among a portion of the patients. A number of research groups in Israel and the world have followed patients who were radiated as children in order to examine this group's susceptibility to cancerous growth. They published one in the medical journal The Lancet, 1974, and they said there was a linkage between irradiation of ringworm patients and the appearance of growths on the head and neck. Well, yeah, of course, because not only did they irradiate them, but they really, really zapped them hard. And I'll be reading more about that down here. So in light of these findings, in 1994, the Knesset passed a law requiring the Israeli government to provide compensation. Okay, so they did provide certain compensation, but here's how they tricked the law. The law, however, placed the burden of proof on the claimant to submit factual evidence substantiating that they had received treatment. So, but of course they couldn't, most of the people couldn't provide this documentation is how it really works, right? The other people that got payment were the people from Marshall Islands. When they got blasted away, they got a settlement, but nobody usually ever really gets settlements. But the Marshall Islands people, their settlement got robbed the last time Trump was president. He made sure that that settlement was just blown to the wind. I think Marshall Islands people had like 50 million left in their settlement, but bye-bye, all gone. They always figure out a way to either steal it back, or what they'll do is they'll give you a settlement, but they'll space it out over years, so that way they actually make more money. Yeah, hard to imagine, but this is how it works. So, the Ringworm Children is what this effort is called. The documentary harshly attacked Israel's medical establishment in the 1950s, branding the episode the Ringworm Children's Holocaust. It also harshly criticized the compensation law and the politicians involved in its passage. It is stated in the documentary that the X-ray radiation used on the children was thousands of times beyond the maximum recommended dosage, and it is suggested that the program was funded by the United States in order to test the effects of large radiation doses on humans. And don't forget, I've talked on and on and on to the point that the U.S. got caught in the 40s irradiating us. And then Bill Clinton apologized, which is really kind of interesting because this whole mining thing that's going on now in the Congo, well, it connects to the Clintons. But I really have to keep going on the kids right now. This documentary states that 100,000 children were irradiated, and that 6,000 of them died shortly after receiving treatment. Therefore, the documentary alleged the campaign against North African immigrants to Israel prior to or following their arrival was only part of an international phenomenon whose scope is still being uncovered. One of their researchers, a medical historian, a Professor Shipra, said, well, let me see what they figure out. So, okay, let's get to how this got started first here. During the years, and this was way before the wars, right? During the years 1921 to 1938, there was a campaign among Jews in Eastern Europe, that is, among Ashkenazi Jews, in the course of which some 27,000 Eastern children were irradiated, in part to allow their families to immigrate, since ringworm was grounds for exclusion of immigrants to the U.S. and elsewhere. So, yeah, 1921 to 1938, this would be leading up to supposedly that war, right? They were giving people the opportunity to radiate their own children. A key figure in formulating and organizing of the Ringworm campaign among the Jewish community in North Africa was Professor Moshe Pyrus, P-R-Y-W-E-S, who would later become president of Ben-Gurion University and the founding dean of Ben-Gurion University's medical school. Pyrus traveled to North Africa in 1947. Following his findings there, he formulated a comprehensive program for eradicating contagious diseases among those planning to immigrate to Israel. Now, isn't that a clever trick, right? Hey, we'll give you safety over here. All of you people that don't feel safe over here, you can come over here to Israel. But before you go, give me your children. Ah, pretty swift trick, right? Parallel to radiation for ringworm carried out during the 1950s in the state of Israel. So they were doing all this irradiating within Israel, but then they were also going around and doing it. Because Yugoslavia, I read this number earlier, but 94,000, Portugal 30,000, Syria 7,000. And just at one hospital in London, they zapped out 1922 to 1958. So who was behind all this? Well, UNICEF. Always rely on the UN for eugenics, right? The primary agent behind these ringworm eradication operations was UNICEF, which even assisted in the purchase of X-ray machines for this purpose. It supplied the X-ray machines were also old army equipment, I think. So it supplied 2 X-ray machines that operated in the immigrant intake and processing facility for immigrants in Israel. In a place called, I can't pronounce it, nowadays it's part of Haifa. With the development of this drug, instead of treating anything simply like with vinegar and stuff, they do have a drug for treating ringworm. So what they said was this: with the development of the drug for treating ringworm, UNICEF, as part of its policy devoted to eradicating contagious disease among mother and children, began funding the supply of the drug to all countries with a high incidence of ringworm. Yeah, well, this drug is obviously very dangerous also, right? So instead of treating it with vinegar like they used to, the UNICEF started supplying drugs to all these countries. And then it gets really interesting. There is a question of how many children of Moroccan origin actually suffered health issues as a result of X-ray ringworm treatment in childhood. Estimates. Others go as farther. A nonprofit said that there were over 200,000 children. Reports submitted to UNICEF by the Israeli Minister of Health, published in the medical news, state that the number of children treated with irradiation in Israel between 1948 to 1959, they're saying it was approximately 15,000. Testimony exists that shows that children of Eastern European origin who were suspected of having ringworm were also irradiated. It is hard to know their numbers, but they most likely numbered a few thousand. And according to this one professor, they did a 1974 study, and they said it seems that the number of Moroccans who are irradiated in the vicinity of 15,000 children. But this is all just guesswork, right? And here is who got it started. In 1951, I was born in 1951, this was not that long ago, 73 years ago to be exact. The Director General of the Israeli Health Ministry, and I want you to write down this name and embed it into your brain, Dr. Chaim, Chaim, Sheba, Sheba, flew to America and returned with 7 X-ray machines supplied to him by the American Army. I got a couple different stories. One is that UNICEF, it doesn't really matter, but one of these stories that said that UNICEF did it. Another one said that this Chaim Sheba, this doctor, flew to the U.S. and picked up the machines. And I believe that one. I believe this one is true. They were to be used in a mass atomic experiment with an entire generation of Sephardi youth, Jewish youth, to be used as guinea pigs. Every Sephardi Jewish child was to be given 35,000 times the maximum dose of X-rays through his head. For doing so, the American government paid the Israeli government 300 million Israeli liras a year. The entire health budget was 60 million liras, so the U.S. gave them 300 million. The money paid by the Americans is equivalent to billions of dollars today. So let me get this straight. So they go to the U.S., they get these equipments, and as a bonus, thanks to U.S. tax dollars, they were given, so the U.S. directly, and I mean directly, is part of murdering these children. No other way around it. Here's how it happened. These are such evil people and such cowards. Who do they go after? Children. Children. They go after the handicapped and the children, and they always do it in some sneaky backwards way. But let me back off of that and tell you how they did it. What they did was this. To fool the parents of the victims, the children were taken away on school trips, and their parents were later told the X-rays were a treatment for the scourge of scalpel ringworm. 6,000 of the children died shortly after their doses were given, while many of the rest developed cancers that killed them over time and are still killing them right now. While living, the victims suffered from disorders such as epilepsy, amnesia, Alzheimer's disease, chronic headaches, and psychosis. And in this show, it says, to watch the Moroccan lady describe what getting 35,000 times the dose of allowable X-rays in her head feels like. And she said, I screamed, make the headaches go away, make the headache go away, make the headache go away, but it never went away. To watch the bearded man hunch down the street. I'm in my 50s and everyone thinks I'm in my 70s. I have to stoop when I walk so I won't fall over. They took my youth away with those X-rays. To watch the old lady who administered the doses to thousands of children. They brought them in lines. First, their heads were shaved and smeared in burning gel. Then a ball was put between their legs, and the children were ordered not to drop it so they wouldn't move. So they actually put burning gel on their heads. They put a ball between their legs and told the children not to drop the ball so they could not move their bodies. The children were not protected over the rest of their bodies. There were no lead vests for them. Because the whole body was exposed to the rays, the genetic makeup of the children was often altered, affecting the next generation. And this is why they're radiating us in our homes with smart meter. They want to destroy our DNA, and the best way to do it is with plutonium. Simple as that. They want you looking in the sky and running all over the place, when in fact we are all being harmed in our own homes. We don't need to go to camps anymore. We have camps inside of our own homes. So everyone notices that Israeli Sephardi women in their 50s today often have sparse, patchy hair, which they try to cover with henna. Most of us assumed it was just a characteristic of Sephardi women. We watch the women on the screen wearing a baseball-style cap. She said, "That was me before my treatment. Now look at me." She removes her hat. Even the red henna can't cover the horrifying, scarred, bald spots on her head. The majority of the victims, I'll pay very close to this, the majority of the victims were Moroccan because they were the most numerous of the Sephardi immigrants. The generation that was poisoned became the country's perpetual poor and criminal class. It did not make sense. So they're saying that the Moroccans who were poisoned became Israel's perpetual poor and criminal class. And they said it did not make sense. The Moroccans who fled to France became prosperous and highly educated. The common explanation was that France got the rich, the smart ones. The real explanation is that every French Moroccan child didn't have his brain cells fried up with gamma rays. The film made it perfectly plain that this operation was no accident. The dangers of X-rays had been known for over 40 years. We read the official guidelines for X-ray treatment in 1952. The maximum dose to be given a child in Israel was 0.5 rad. There was no mistake made. The children were deliberately poisoned. They make a point that only Sephardi children received the X-rays. And this person said, "I was in class, and the men came to take us on a tour. They asked our names. The Ashkenazi children were told to return to their seats. The dark children were put on the bus." So, there was a little story here I'll read you. In 1951, the Director General of the Israeli Health Ministry, Dr. Chaim Shiba, flew to America and returned with 7 X-ray machines. They were to be used in a mass atomic experiment with an entire generation of Sephardi youth to be used as guinea pigs. Each Sephardi Jew child was to be given 35,000 times the maximum of dose of X-rays through their head. And that was why the U.S. paid for all of this done. And then, of course, they had to trick the parents, right? And the really sad thing is, I hope you'll watch that documentary down below, but the really, really sad news is a lot of these kids blame their parents because they couldn't figure out how this happened to them. They figured their parents must have told the schools that it was okay to do that to them. So, I'm going to put this on hold for half a second here and scroll down here. Okay, this is a pretty good clip, quote clip. The film presents a historian who first gives a potted history of the eugenics movement. In a later soundbite, he declares that the ringworm operation was a eugenics program aimed at weeding out the perceived weak strains of society. The film now quotes 2 noted anti-Sephardi racist Jewish leaders, Nahum Goldman and Levi Eshkol. That's spelled E-S-H-K-O-L. Goldman spent the Holocaust years first in Switzerland, where he made sure few Jewish refugees were given shelter, then flew to New York to become the head of the World Jewish Congress, headed by Samuel Bronfman, Bronfman. So evidently, Bronfman had cut a deal with Prime Minister Mackenzie King to prevent the immigration of European Jews into Canada. But Levi Eshkol's role in the Holocaust was far more sinister than merely not saving lives. He was busy taking them instead. And this, from this biography, it says this: in 1937, Levi Eshkol played a central role in the establishment of the Mirkwarod Water Company, and in his role was instrumental in convincing the German government to allow Jews immigrating to Palestine to take with them some of their assets, mostly in the form of German-made equipment. While world Jewry was boycotting the Nazi regime in the 1930s, the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem was propping up Hitler. Of course it was, right? They're all on the same team. A deal called the Transfer Agreement was cut, whereby the Nazis would chase Germany's Jews to Palestine, and the labor Zionists would force the immigrants to use their assets to buy only German goods. So yeah, the Jewish Agency in Jerusalem, they propped up Hitler. They made a deal called the Transfer Agreement. So Nazis could then chase Germany's Jews to Palestine, and the labor Zionists would force the immigrants to use their assets to buy only German goods. Once the Jewish Agency got the German Jews it wanted, those they secretly indoctrinated in the anti-Judaism of Shabbat and Jacob Frank. Oh. Okay, so there's two people, the Jacob Frank and the Shabbat. It's TZVI. So what they did was they then let the Nazis take care of the rest of European Jewry. Jewry, Jewry. You have to excuse me. I'm getting so much radiation in my own. Speaking of radiation, that when your teeth start to fall out when you're getting radiation, they don't just fall out like the whole tooth falls out. What happens is I now have like all these chips of teeth in my mouth. When I go to talk, I've been having to reformulate words, so that's why I sound so weird. But anyway, so okay, the Holocaust was a eugenics program, and Levi Eshkol played a major role in it. So they were talking about this movie, and they said the Moroccan lady is back on the screen. It was a Holocaust, a Sephardi Holocaust. And what I want to know is why no one stood up to stop it. Yeah, why did nobody stop any of this stuff? All I want to know was what they did to me. I wanted to know who authorized it. I wanted to trace the chain of command. But the Ministry of Health told me my records were missing. So the health minister spokesperson chimes in and says almost all the records were burned in a fire. Boy, that's surprising, isn't it? They burned all the records. Okay, so they went on to say, so let's help them trace the chain of command. And the person says, but now I must intrude myself in the review. Almost 6 years ago, I investigated the kidnapping of some 4,500, mostly Yemenite immigrant infants and children during the early years of the state. I met the leader of the Yemenite children's movement, Rabbi Meshulam, in prison for trying to get the truth out. He was later returned home in a vegetative state from which he has not emerged. He told me that the kidnapped children were sent to America to die cruelly in nuclear experiments. The American government had banned human testing and needed guinea pigs. The Israeli government agreed to supply the humans in exchange for money and nuclear secrets. The initiator of Israel's nuclear program was Defense Minister Director General Shimon Peres, P-E-R-E-S. And that makes sense because they stopped doing the radiation tests on here in the 40s. So here again, in the 50s, they're testing people over in Israel. Rabbi David Sevilla of Jerusalem corroborated the crime, and later I even saw photos of the radiation scars on the few surviving children. And the cages the infants were shipped to America in. So here again, they're shipping children around in cages. They were doing cages out there at China Lake. I'll keep reading. Just over 5 years ago, I published my belief on the internet that Israel's labor Zionist founders had conducted atomic experiments on Yemenite and other Sephardi children, killing thousands of them. Almost 3 years ago, I published the same assertion in my last book called Save Israel. I suffered much scorn for doing so. However, I was right. We return to the documentary. We are told that a U.S. law in the late 1940s put a stop to the human radiation experiments conducted on prisoners, the mentally feeble, and the like. The American atomic program needed a new source of human lab rats, and the Israeli government supplied it. So the people in charge, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, this was who approved all this. Finance Minister, last name Kaplan. Settlement Minister Levi Eshkol. Foreign Minister Moshe Sharei. Health Minister Yosef Berg. Labor Minister Golda Meir. Police Minister Amos Ben-Gurion. The highest-ranking non-cabinet post belonged to the Director General of the Defense Ministry, Shimon Peres, P-E-R-E-S. That's a program involving the equivalent of billions of U.S. dollars. American-funded government should be unknown to the Prime Minister of cash-strapped Israel is ridiculous. So they're saying they didn't know what happened, right? Well, they can say that because they burned all the records, right? Ben-Gurion was in on the horrors and undoubtedly chose his son to be police minister in case anyone interfered with them. Now let's have a quick glance at the other plotters, starting with the finance minister named Kaplan. He handled the profits of the operation and was rewarded for eternity with a hospital named after him named Rehoboth. He's not alone in this honor. The racist bigot Shaib Shiba, who ran Ringworm Incorporated, has a whole medical complex named after him. Needless to say, if there is an ounce of decency in the local medical profession, those hospital names will have to change. Then there is Yosef Berg, B-U-R-G, who was the leaders of the Yemenite children's movement. They insist was the most responsible for the kidnapping of their infants. As health minister, Berg certainly played a pivotal role in the Ringworm murders. That would go a great way to explaining the peculiar behavior of his son, the peacemaker, Abraham Berg. Let's not forget Moshe Sharei, who had Rabbi Yoel Brand arrested in Aleppo in 1944 for proposing a practical way to save 800,000 Jews trapped in Hungary. Sharet's most cited quote is this: If Shimon Peres ever enters this government, I will tear my clothes and start to mourn. Several Yemenite children activists told me Charette was referring to the kidnapping of the Yemenite children when he made this statement. And other amateur historians have told me that Levi Eshkol openly and proudly announced his belief in the tenets of Shabbat TZBI, but try as I haven't tracked down a citation. However, we do know of Eshkol that during the period of the radiations, he first served as settlement minister. So, yeah, Eshkol was the person most responsible for Israel's immigrants, the ones he sent to radiation torture chambers. Finally, there is Golda Meir. We don't know her role, but she was in on the secret and rewarded for it. Note that every prime minister thereafter until 1977, when the Honorable Menachem Begin was elected, came from this cabal. And note also that no one from what is called the right today was privy to the slaughter of the Sephardi children. Apply that lesson to a contemporary fact. It is the descendants of these butchers who brought us the Oslo peace and are determined to wipe out the settlers of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, as surely they had dealt with the inferior dark Jews who came into their clutches 50 years before. Now try and imagine it is 1952 and you are in a cabinet meeting. You will be debating whether to send the Yemenite babies to America for their final zapping or whether to have them zapped here. That is what the Luciferian, satanic, Sabbatean founders of our nation were prattling about when they got together to discuss the affairs of state. After the film ended, TV host Dan Margolin tried to put a better face on what he witnessed. Any face had to be better than what he had seen. He explained meekly, but the state was so poor, it was only a matter of day-to-day survival. Then he stopped. He knew there was no excusing the atrocities the Sephardi children endured. But it was a Moroccan singer who summed up the experience best. It is going to hurt, but the truth has to be told. If not, the wounds will never heal. There is one person alive who knows the truth and participated in the atrocities. He is the leader of the opposition, Shimon Peres, the peacemaker. The only way to get to the truth and start the healing is to investigate him and for his role in the kidnapping of 4,500 Yemenite infants and the mass poisoning of over 100,000 Sephardi Jew children and youth. But here is why that won't happen. It is a miracle that Ringworm Children was broadcast at all. Clearly, though someone fought for it, but had to agree to a compromise. The show was aired at the same time as the highest rated show of the year, the final of Israel's A Star is Born. The next day, there was not a word about it. The Ringworm Children were not mentioned in any paper, but the newly born star's photo took up half the front pages. Do you realize what this means? This says a lot about the society we're in right now. The show, the Ringworm Children, airs, okay? They air it at the same time as the A Star is Born reality show. Everybody tuned into that show. However, a few 100,000 people saw the film on their screens and they will never forget the truth. If the Rabin assassination doesn't bury labor Zionism for good, then the Ringworm Children eventually will. So, I believe that this happened, those years, They were trying to, the clip says it all, they needed to have Jewish children. They had to have those Jewish children to make their work. So I'm going to put this on hold for a second here real quick and see if I can close this file out. Okay, so I really wanted to tell this story because what's going on now, I was watching this documentary about the Paradise Papers, you know, the money they're hiding offshore. And there's only a few people involved. There's a man out of Israel, and he was given money by a U.S. company for the mining business there. So there's only a few people, but 100%, I said before, the war in the Congo is going on and continuing to go on because while there is war, then nobody's looky, right? So while there is war going on, who is benefiting? Well, I have 100% proof that it is the United States and Israel. So I hope that you can start to draw some connections of your own. Obviously, the United States, I believe, nobody has to believe with me. Everybody has their own opinions, right? I believe the entire reason for the Middle East, for putting Israel right there in the middle of the Middle East, was to rob and mine and steal everything from that area. They've been doing all this minerals mapping. This whole thing going on in the Congo is just the tip of the iceberg. And 100%, just like I can now say with confidence, 100%, the United States effectively murdered all of these Sephardic Jewish children. Full stop. No other way around this story. So that is how I see it, at least. And then I will be back to put the robbery of the Congo into context. They did all kinds of things with Israel. They're letting in rapists. They've got all of those Orthodox Jews raping all the children. Israel was set up on purpose, and I believe the purpose was for them to take over all the mining and all the things in Africa. So be safe out there. I'll be back with how the rest of this story works out. Goodbye for now.